Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon, Dr. Tharoor. Welcome to Singapore.
Great to be back. It's a lovely place.
You have a deep connection with Singapore, so
Indeed,
good to be back.
I headed the UN office here for refugees from 81 to 84, so that goes back a very long way.
Very long.
It was a very different Singapore, as you can imagine, but anyway.
Yes, indeed. So the topic of discussion today for us is the future of tech policy. And I have to tell the audience this. I had a certain line of questioning prepared, thinking that we'll talk about AI and we'll talk about cryptocurrencies and we'll talk about flying taxis and autonomous vehicles and what have you. But all of that changed the last 2 days. And so, obviously, my starting question to you today is what's on everyone's mind, which is the US election outcome.
Botswana, right? Sorry.
No, Dr. Tharoor, you've guessed my first question, which is essentially on the US election outcome, Trump 2.0, and what that looks like, not for the US, but for the rest of the world. Good, bad, or dare I say, not so pretty?
Look, it's always difficult to predict anything to do with Mr. Trump because he's a fairly mercurial figure, as we all know, and he does say and do a lot of things. But I think it's fair to say we needn't expect too many surprises since he did have 4 years in office, and people have seen pretty much what they can expect from them. Certainly from the point of view of Asia, and certainly Southeast Asia and India, there is some concern about tariffs because he's made lots of threatening noises. Though it wasn't, I think, an issue in his victory speech. So maybe he'll downsize that and focus on immigration instead, which doesn't affect most of us. The other thing that comes up potentially for a country like India, which supplies a lot of talent to the US, would be whether all this talk about cutting back on immigration might also create a bit of a problem for legal immigration, and then for family reunion, H-1B visa holders, all of that. So that's a second area of concern. Then broadly, you know that Mr. Trump has been pretty confrontational about China.
Yeah.
And I imagine that isn't going to change a lot because that seems to go pretty deep into his own instincts. And
will he be tougher?
Could be. I think a lot depends on various things that are yet unclear, including his choice of a Secretary of State and all sorts of things. We don't know who the foreign policy team is going to consist of. But I will say that Mr. Trump definitely didn't fulfill the worst predictions of the alarmists last time around. But he did embark on pretty much a trade war with China. And so you've got to see that there's at least a possibility of that trade war 2.0 in this administration.
And a tech war as well.
No, on tech, he's made some. First of all, he doesn't say a lot about tech himself, but his policy people, that is the Trump-Vance manifesto, for example, has declared that they're going to reject and undo Joe Biden's executive order on AI, which is a very interesting question because that was hailed at the time by the AI community as being a very progressive regulation stepping forward. And suddenly you're finding the possibility that this might be undone. In fact, Trump himself made some comment about it being radical left-wing stuff, which certainly...
So ethical AI goes out of the window?
So not just ethical AI, but even the capacity to regulate AI would be scrapped if we take him literally. And there'd be a complete free hand to develop AI as you wish in America. That seems to be what his policy statement and his own remark. That's number one.
Okay.
Two more. He's also made lots of noises about crypto, which have encouraged that community. Those who are interested in, said Americans should be free to mine Bitcoin and so on and so forth. That's going to be an important issue. And the third one is perhaps a little more reassuring to the Chinese. He actually said that maybe he'll undo the ban on TikTok because he says that banning TikTok has only helped Facebook, which he doesn't like. He calls Mark Zuckerberg Zuckerschmuck and so on. He says, I don't want to help Zuckerschmuck. Let's unban TikTok. Now, was that a stray remark? Is he serious? We're going to find out. But there are some uncertainties, therefore, in what Trump's tech policy actions are going to be.
And I'll scratch that point again a bit. But, you know, as a seasoned politician who's had a career in politics over many decades, I think the hot button issue for a lot of people is, will he walk the talk on his campaign promises, or will he tone down the rhetoric and be more practical in his approach once he enters the White House in January?
I think the answer is a bit of both. We've seen this again last time around. You know, no one really thought he'd build a wall. He built a wall. It may not have been completely a wall. It was a barbed wire fence in some places, but he built something.
Construction.
Similarly, he said he would have a Muslim ban. No one thought that was even possible. He had a Muslim ban for a while. Some countries couldn't get visas very easily. So, I mean, I wouldn't discount Mr. Trump's capacity to go ahead and fulfill some of his statements. Some he may actually have no political resistance to fulfilling, but he may have practical problems. And the example is his threat to deport the 12 million illegal immigrants in America. Now, the House and the Senate might support him because they're all in Republican hands. But how do you in practice go around, knocking on doors, identifying illegal immigrants, picking them up, arresting them, and deporting them? There's a whole mechanics of that that seems almost mind-bogglingly impossible to conceive of. So some of these things may remain in the realm of rhetoric. Some may just become more unpleasant for people but not be fully implemented. Some may actually happen. We'll just have to see.
In the new world order, Dr. Tharoor, do you think the old adage, as goes America, so goes the world, may not hold this time around, because economies like India, China, Japan, many other countries have really come into their own, especially China and India over the last decade?
Well, the adage, I think, applies to various kinds of things and not just to whether economies can rise. It could also be about, for example, the rise of this right-wing populism, which we've seen not only in America, but being echoed in many other places. Mr. Trump, in many ways, seems to be a sort of harbinger of a particular kind of tradition. He's already been welcomed by Mr. Orban in Hungary. I think Mr. Erdogan in Turkey will not be very unhappy. Mr. Modi in India is quite delighted. There is a certain group of people who I think will find a lot to be happy about in Mr. Trump's ascent. But you're right. I mean, many economies have found their own strength. India is growing, for example, quite significantly in the last few years, post-COVID, and India may feel a little less vulnerable. On the other hand, Mr. Trump is a transactional leader. He's pretty much told the Indians, you're an abuser because you've got tariffs on some of my goods, so I'll put tariffs on you. Now, that kind of thing could be problematic for a country like India. See, American goods, the tariffs are priced into why people want them.
Yeah.
Whereas Indian goods to America sell partially because they're less expensive than alternatives. Now, if suddenly tariffs drive the prices up, Indian exports might be seriously affected. So these are pretty serious issues that people will have to think about. But as I said, he didn't talk about tariffs and trade very much in his victory speech. His focus seems to be on more domestic issues. And there are a couple of things that his economic advisors, whenever they're named, whoever they are, will have to point out to him. You know, if you put on tariffs, it means that your American consumers are going to be paying more at the Walmart for everything they want, right? So that's already going to have a negative impact that he's going to have to worry about on people who are his constituency, the sort of blue-collar workers, the middle-class youngsters and so on who voted for him will suddenly find that they can't afford the things they used to have. Now, he might say, well, I'll give them tax cuts, but his tax cuts are mainly going to benefit the rich, not so much the lower echelons. It's very difficult to figure out how the economics of all this will work. But tariffs per se will obviously have an inflationary effect, and that's something which I'm not sure the Americans really have a lot of political tolerance for.
Well, if you go by the bond markets are pricing in higher borrowing costs and are pricing in perhaps a resurgence of inflation, upside risk to inflation.
Same with the dollar appreciating.
Absolutely, and that has to do with the fact that, in fact, I was reading a report on how tax cuts plus tariff risk is going to lead to inflation, and that's something that he may have to contend with going forward. That is a story for down the road, but I do want to get your thoughts in before we talk about the future of tech policy on cryptos and everything else, AI as well. Geopolitics, Ukraine war, NATO, what happens there?
Well, I think NATO, ever since he was tough on them in his first term, a lot more countries have gone up to that 2% level of GDP on defense, which is what he wanted. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the current NATO Secretary General, who's actually well disposed towards Trump, Mark Rutte, said that two-thirds of his members have already hit the 2% GDP mark. And that means something that I think Trump can take satisfaction in, that he's driven them to spend more money. On the question of the Ukraine thing, he said he can stop it in a minute.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about that. Because
The
the fact
moment he
is,
gets elected, he says he can end the war.
in a minute. But the fact is, in that minute, what exactly is he going to do? Is he going to pull the plug on American arms exports? Is he going to pull the plug on American money? Is he going to pull the plug on American advisors? Not yet clear. Besides, why would the Europeans follow suit? They're still helping. There's lots of weapons from many European countries that are going into Ukraine, and the Ukrainians seem to be still determined to continue fighting. They've lost their territory, they've lost people, they've had damaged cities. They don't particularly necessarily want to stop. At this stage, there's been no particular sign of post-election warming with Moscow. You may notice that the congratulatory messages did not include one from President Putin, and his spokesman said, well, you're talking about a hostile country that's at war with us. How do you expect us to congratulate him? So, I mean, let's not
That's managing
immediately...
the optics, you think?
No, I mean, look, it may be optics, but the truth is, Tanvir, that if you really look objectively at many of these things, there are factors that may go beyond an individual's predilection. So I wouldn't be prepared to assume that Ukraine is going to be sold down the river within a week. But if it does begin to happen that way, and there is a greater pressure for conciliation, there might be more interest on the part of Ukraine to find elements that would actually permit some sort of settlement. We'll have to see. Conversely, on the Gaza conflict, it looks like Mr. Trump wants to give Mr. Netanyahu a completely free hand to do whatever he wants. He's just fired his relatively moderate defense minister. So he's clearly determined to continue prosecuting this war. To what point, God alone knows. Are you going to wipe out the entire population of Gaza? I don't understand. But whatever it may be, he's going to have no resistance in Trump-led Washington.
Indeed, Dr. Tharoor. And of course, that's a space that we'll be watching very closely. To the topic at hand, which is the future of Trump's tech policy and the implications it can have for the rest of the world. We've seen three main trades over the last 24 hours, 48 hours now. Bitcoin, the US dollar, and Tesla.
Yeah.
Right? Let's start with cryptos and the crypto mania. What do you take away from it?
Well, he clearly is big on it. I'm not sure how much he understands about it all, but he said he's going to deregulate, he's going to let people mine Bitcoin quite freely, he's going to be completely open on crypto. He even actually said, I love crypto, which promptly drove crypto values up.
Yeah.
We'll have to see how all that works. Other countries, I think Singapore and India, for example, are both countries that are seriously looking into central bank denominated crypto trade, but they're not looking at issuing bitcoins to the general public.
Yeah.
And many countries are taking that kind of fairly cautious approach because it's a very speculative instrument, right? You can shoot up in value one day, shoot down another, but that doesn't faze Mr. Trump. So we'll have to see. I think that looks like something where the Americans may take off in a particular direction.
But that's the question. His endorsement of cryptos, do you think will find universal acceptance and adoption of cryptocurrencies at a time when, like you said, a lot of countries, minus the US, have done a lot of work on CBDCs the last 4 years.
Yeah.
Some of them have also run trials on their currencies, right? Whether it's the e-Sing dollar, whether it's the yen, the digital rupee. But we've not seen much of that happen in the US, and Trump is in fact dissing the whole idea of a digital dollar. So how does that work then? Because you need to have more universal acceptance of all central banks coming together and having some sort of common objective out here.
It won't be common, because I think Mr. Trump is going to strike out in his own direction, just as he will on climate change, where he's clearly not going to make common cause with the rest of the world, not even the rest of the Western world. He's very clearly a climate change denialist, and he's going to say no. So the short answer on crypto and so on is we don't know, and we're not even sure Mr. Trump knows. I think we're just going to see how this is going to go on in the next few months. Yeah.
On AI?
AI, I think they are very keen on taking and maintaining and extending their lead in AI. And it's true that, you know, one of the areas that Trump has spoken about, and the US generally, is, of course, controlling a monopoly of the most advanced chips that are used in AI, the NVIDIA chips and so on. Whereas the Chinese don't have that. What the Chinese are talking about is they can compete on AI through a more sensible architecture. And they're also talking about their advantages in energy and so on and so forth. So it'll be an interesting race. It won't proceed on some sort of linear line with the US ahead and the Chinese behind. They'll be on parallel lines, and we'll have to see who actually makes more advances. India is going to be an interesting element in all of this, because India is also taking AI very seriously, very late. And suddenly we're going to see a mushrooming, I think, of educational institutions, training and teaching AI. There's going to be, as usual, a huge proliferation of talent. I mean, there's this wonderful joke I heard a version of yesterday, which goes that the US innovates, the Europeans regulate, the Chinese imitate, the Japanese animate, and India proliferates. So you can have this whole bunch of all these Indian AI people who are going to come up and suddenly be available for the world. So, and presumably they're going to be closer to US companies and US developers and so on than they are to the Chinese. So it should be a very interesting period in AI on global policy front in the next year or two.
So you say that well, but I want to understand, even if India is late to the party, very late, like you said, can it catch up quickly?
It
at a time,
could, but catch up is one thing India will not have, for example, is the kind of same access to the NVIDIA chips and so on that the Americans have. So
could be the manufacturer, because I asked this question earlier on.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, all the AI chips that NVIDIA puts out there into the market
are designed in India,
are manufactured in Taiwan, the TSMC, right?
They're designed in India, manufactured in Taiwan, but they're American intellectual property.
They have American IP. I asked Piyush Goyal this last month, who's the Indian Commerce Minister, on whether India could be Taiwan +1 when it comes to chip manufacturing.
Right.
And Jensen Huang was recently in India. He sat down with Mukesh Ambani and had a fairly expanded conversation on the same issue. And Piyush Goyal told me, well, India could very well fill the gap, given that Taiwan is caught in the crosshairs of US-China politics.
I don't know. I mean, what I've heard so far is that it would take us an enormous leap to be able to manufacture those chips in India. The conditions apparently don't exist, but I don't claim to be an expert. If we can do it and the government can help create the basic infrastructure to make that possible, great. That would be the one way we can do it. But to the best of my understanding, we are nowhere near close.
Okay. On the AI revolution, I want your take on the hype versus the reality. Like, there's been so much. And, with lower rates, obviously, you're going to fuel the AI CapEx cycle even more. We just had the Fed cut rates again by 25 basis points. And everybody's saying if borrowing costs go down, that's just going to be adding fuel to fire when it comes to what's happening with AI R&D. Should we embrace this AI revolution? Should we be scared at the pace at which changes are happening? How should society really look at it broadly?
Well, there's some people who are already scared and have said so, as you know. But I think you just can't put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, AI is out there, and we've got to see how best we can use it for the benefit of humanity. But there are real ethical questions, and I'm glad that people have woken up to the fact that we need to confront those ethical questions even as we're developing AI applications. And there are so many different issues out there. Creative people are concerned about AI's ability to imitate and create art, create music, create even novels have been submitted to publishers, have been written by AI. By the way, India has more ChatGPT users than the US has, which is unbelievable, but that's already happening. Second, of course, there's a concern about things like civil liability issues. I think you remember the incident when a driverless car killed a pedestrian in San Francisco. Who's liable? And here were questions. They said there was nothing wrong with the car, but there was a safety driver who was distracted by her cell phone. So what about, is she personally liable? She says, I'm not driving the car, why am I liable? These are complicated issues, ethical issues that have to be looked at. There are fundamental questions about how far you can afford to train AI models. Right now, governments are supposed to have pretty much agreed that they will not, for example, put AI into anything nuclear. Can you imagine a sort of AI program deciding objectively, without any sense of morality, values, whatever, that some objective requires to be nuked? We can't afford to do that. So they've said they're going to not do that. But could there be rogue elements that might come out of hand? We don't know. To what degree does autonomous intelligence come and start doing things that human beings would not do? Can you program morality into AI? I mean, there's dozens. I won't even scratch the surface. There are dozens of questions that have to be addressed. And I think it's extremely important the world pays as much attention to these questions as to the scientific excitement of what goes on. Unemployment as a result of AI.
Yeah.
Huge degrees of complications
And so
there.
what does that mean for countries like India and China with big populations?
Well, I can give you one example of something much earlier than advanced AI, which is when India became the world leader in medical transcription. Do you remember the first decade of the 21st century? American doctors were dictating their notes into a machine, zinging it over to India when they went to sleep. Somebody in India with basic medical training was typing up the transcripts, zinging it back. The American doctor came the next morning, his notes were there. Wonderful. They were firing their secretaries and hiring guys sitting in Chennai to write the medical transcripts.
Yeah.
Within a decade, dead. The entire business collapsed. Why? Because AI enabled voice recognition software. Meant you buy one software, you don't have to spend money in India every month. You speak into your computer and your notes appear on your screen. And the software corrects itself, so if it doesn't understand your accent the first time around, you correct it once or twice, it'll learn. So suddenly, the doctors don't need the Indians anymore. Mass Gen Hospital and many of the top hospitals in America used to get their MRIs read in India.
Yep.
Why? Because again, they had a shortage of radiologists in America. Now the MRIs are being read by AI. They don't need the Indian radiologists. Now, these are just two examples. There'll be a dozen
Very
more.
pertinent.
I mean, as an Indian policymaker and a politician, I would certainly be resistant to driverless cars coming into India. I have 25 million Indians who know no other profession than driving, who drive trucks and tractors and bulldozers and cars and everything for a living.
Leave alone flying taxis.
Exactly.
You're not even going there. Yeah, but you think unemployment could be a big risk, a big fallout of
Absolutely.
expanded
And
AI interest?
Obviously, the converse argument is that every new technology has caused unemployment and that new jobs have been found. The famous example that everyone likes to give are how the buggy whip manufacturers disappeared when horse-driven carriages got replaced by cars.
100%.
Similarly, when movies went from the silent era into sound movies, there were, every movie theater had an orchestra. There was a pit for an orchestra, and they would play along with the silent movies. They all lost their jobs. The world in the 1930s was full with unemployed musicians. But some of them, I'm afraid, probably stayed unemployed or played in nightclubs for less money or whatever. But some just learned other things. And you can do some retraining, but it depends on the age of the person. It depends on a whole lot of factors, what the economy requires, what can be sustained. So there is going to be a human price to be paid, and we better be conscious of the policy implications of that.
But when you speak to technologists, and I remember having a conversation with Satya Nadella on this, he was talking about how he countered the whole issue of joblessness or the loss of jobs by saying that new jobs will be created, under the AI umbrella. And I don't know whether you guys have seen this viral video on Instagram, sir. I don't know if you've checked it out. But this video on Instagram was doing the rounds the last couple of days where it was a clip from 1995 where Bill Gates was explaining the internet to David Letterman. And David Letterman was saying, oh, but you have the radio for that, you have a tape recorder, why do I need the internet? Cut to 10 years later, and you had two big businesses coming out of the internet, which are trillion-dollar businesses today, Facebook as well as Google, right? So society adapted.
Absolutely.
They became big employers. Today, a lot of businesses are thriving on the internet. So is it only a matter of, does society really have a choice? Or does it, is it only a matter of time where society adopts the change, and then becomes a part of it? And new jobs, like I said, get created, and people then move on and then move on to the next thing.
To a great extent, you're right, Tanvir, but what about quantity? For example, the Oxford Martin School had a report that said 30% of the jobs by 2030 will be jobs that don't exist today. Now, that means that jobs are going to be invented between now and then, which will suddenly come on stream, and there'll be new jobs available. But how many? If you're going to be throwing, for argument's sake, 100 million people out of jobs, are you going to be creating 100 million new jobs or 50? So it's not just that there are new jobs that people who can be trained will learn how to do. It's how many and where they'll go to get them. So it's not there are no easy answers.
What about the data security angle to AI, the national security risks? The whole example that you gave of TikTok.
Yep.
Trump was against TikTok because he doesn't know where the data is being stored, how the data is likely to be used. And so that U-turn on TikTok, I find that amazing, because at the end of the day, Facebook is still a US-based company. And so wouldn't that be an issue?
It could well be, and it may well be
AI
that he said it
expands?
in order to issue a sort of a shot, a broadside against the bows of Mr. Zuckerberg, and that thereafter Mr. Zuckerberg was very quick to congratulate Mr. Trump on his victory.
He was, yes.
Might fall in line and behave himself, and Mr. Trump may decide that he dislikes China more than he dislikes Zuckerberg, as he calls him. So, I mean,
It's still a homegrown company.
You just don't know exactly, and that's certainly a powerful argument as well. So let's see. I mean, he may not do a U-turn on TikTok, but he might still go ahead, and some of these processes are on in the courts and so on. We'll have to see how that goes. I will say, however, that broadly speaking, he likes, as many of these right-wing leaders do, to identify an enemy, or at least an adversary, and he has identified China as that. So there is a general desire on the part of Mr. Trump and many of his advisors to cut China down to size, to curb its pretensions, to make sure they're not a rival to America, and so on. And that will be an animating feature of his approach, whether it's on AI, whether it's on other subjects, and certainly whether it's going to be on military matters as well. And I'm assuming the policymakers in Beijing are smart enough not to provoke an erratic leader into doing worse.
But the question of AI and data security, data protection is something that other jurisdictions have also raised, you know, when it comes to Chinese companies.
Yeah.
And whether it's India, whether
Sure.
it's the UK, right? At the end of
Germany.
the day, how do you kind of internalize that? How do you think about it as AI explodes?
Well, I mean, there's no question that security will be an issue, and a country like India certainly has genuine worries about how far the Chinese should be allowed into certain sectors.
And also bad actors like Russia.
Sure. But the fact is that, you know, they can allow them into other sectors. The issue of data protection versus data portability is a totally different issue. There's a global debate going on. You know, many countries want to have data localization, servers in their own countries. Why should my citizens' data be going off to a server in America? That sort of stuff is still going on in many countries, including India. But there are others saying, look, unless you have data portability, you won't be so attractive. Your data won't matter so much if you can't connect it globally. And I think that there's a good case to be made for that latter argument as well, which I'm quite sympathetic to. A country like Singapore thrives on data being generated in dozens of other countries. How will Singapore do it if every country wanted to keep things to itself? What happens? So there are real issues here that we have to understand require a certain amount of flexibility and maybe a little more international dialogue on how you can ensure security and limitations on some things, but portability and transferability of most. That kind of formula will have to be worked out.
You know, you touched upon the tariff war. Obviously, there is, like I said, this tech war going on in the world. You call tech war, tech race, AI race. Everybody's investing in it. Everybody's throwing their hat in the ring. I want to understand from you, who do you think will come out, dare I say, a winner? And can there be a winner? Or will countries continue to decouple and kind of build their own independent ecosystem? Or can there be interoperability?
You know, the tech wars are fine as long as the winner is humanity. If as a result of competition between different groups, different countries, different companies, we end up with better innovations, better products, advantages that help us all, great. I mean, some tech wars have created losers, whether it was on, you know, what DVD standards you would have or what video standards you would have in an earlier generation or whatever. Some technologies won out, some technologies lost, and they all seemed viable at one time, and no one really knows why one won and the other one lost, but it happened. On the other hand, there are some things where many technologies coexisted at the same time. Again, look at videos. You know, you had some countries on the NTSC standard, two different NTSC standards, some on the CCAM standard, again, two different CCAM standards, some on the PAL standard, and all of these things coexisted. It was a nuisance when you travel from one country to the other, but by and large, you could have all these technologies working. Both models could apply in this field too. I think we should keep an open mind. What helps people? Let that work.
Like smartphones.
True. There's so many different companies out there, so many different kinds of smartphones, so many variations, so many different price points. And you got something that helps everybody. I mean, India, Jio is giving people practically a phone that costs less than $5. A 400 rupee phone. I'm sorry, a 4,000 rupee phone. So $50, not $5. I beg your pardon. Yeah. But still, I mean, you're
really
talking very, very cheap stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it might come cheaper still with time.
With time, yeah. I think the larger issue there, Dr. Tharoor, is how can we ensure technology is not to the privilege and advantage of a few, but benefits society as a whole. Fair and square.
That's not easy to do, but it has to be done. I mean, most democracies will absolutely want to ensure that. Mr. Trump talks about completely freeing up AI, for example, freeing up the tech space. He considers regulation to be dangerous, radical stuff. The truth is, everything, including in America, is regulated. Now, if indeed Mr. Musk is going to sit on a commission and strip out most of the regulations in America, we'll have to see what he recommends, what actually passes, what gets done. But if you're going to have a deregulated America in many tech areas, other countries may suddenly have to look and see how that's going to affect them. The Europeans have set very high regulatory standards, as you know. And these are questions which many companies are grappling with, but many have acquiesced in because they want to be in Europe and they'll just have to play along with the way the European Union wants them to play. We'll just have to see how all this goes.
That's another worry. Before we wrap up, I know we're completely out of time. That's another worry. Are we going to be looking at a deregulated regime under Trump 2.0 or light regulation?
Well, what he says essentially sounds like deregulation. In practice, it's bound to be, there's got to be some regulation somewhere. Even I remember Zuckerberg's famous statement a few years ago, the question is not whether there should be regulation, the question is what kind of regulation there should be. And that's something, that was in the context of the internet and social media, but it applies to AI and everything else as well. It seems to me there will be some light regulation, but let's see what Mr. Musk and his proposals come out with and what Mr. Trump decides he likes or doesn't like about them.
Wearing a politician's hat, what is right regulation?
Right regulation is regulation that actually enables growth and development of any particular product, service, or whatever, while at the same time curbing unethical issues, monopoly capitalism and crony capitalism, and any actual harm to society and to national security. That's what sensible regulation ought to be.
And can Trump 2.0 deliver on that?
Can every country find ways of doing that in their own interests? It varies from country to country. You might have a slightly heavy hand as in Europe. You might have too light a hand in America. We'll just have to find the right means. But each country will have to work out what's right for them.
As we wrap up this discussion, Dr. Tharoor, if we were to have the same conversation next year, same time, give us some of your predictions on what we're going to be seeing.
I smashed my crystal ball on the way over. Look, I mean, I think Ray Kurzweil said that change is now so dizzying that in the 21st century, we're not going to see 100 years of change, we're going to see 20,000 years of change. Now, if that's the kind of prediction we're talking about, in this 1 year, we might see, God knows, 200 years of change. So let's not predict until we see each other.
As long as my avatar is not talking to your avatar same time next year, I'm okay.
Great,
but
thank you.
Dr. Tharoor, thank you very much.
Such a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Such a pleasure having you today on the forum and stage here. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Come on, let's give them another round of applause. What an amazing conversation. Thank you both.